Hello, and welcome to William Shakespeare, the man, the myth, the legend. So through this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about what you should have picked up on in your Explore section, as well as a few other tidbits of knowledge that will help you understand who Shakespeare is. So William Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon. He was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, apparently on April 23rd, 1564. We don't actually know his birthday. We do know that he was baptized on the 26th, meaning that he wouldn't have had to have been born within that week. So typically it was 3 to 7 days for them to be baptized. And we have chosen April 23rd as his birth date. He was also the third of 8 children born to Mary Arden and John Shakespeare. John Shakespeare was a glover, meaning that he literally made gloves. We don't necessarily know where or how long he went to school. We do know that he probably attended King's New School. Education was not mandatory for students. However, John Shakespeare, being of the newly rising merchant class, would have required his son to go to school to be literate. So here's a picture of what the King's New School may have looked like, and this is the building that we recognize as being Shakespeare's birthplace. You will also notice this style of building, that this is what we call a Tudor style. The Tudors were the ruling family of England up until the death of Queen Elizabeth I. So let's look at his adult family, or his adulthood and family. Learning to read with Miss Askins. So, in 1582, we know that he married Anne Hathaway. We do have record of this. When he died, he willed his second best bed to her. They also had the birth of their daughter, Susanna, who was born and baptized not quite 9 months after their wedding. They had 2 other children, and Hamnet, his only son, passed away. We don't necessarily know the cause of his death, but there's also speculation that Hamnet inspired Hamlet, the play. We know that between the years of 1585 and 1592 that he disappears from public record. We, as Shakespeare scholars, call these sometimes the sonnet years. We don't exactly know what he was doing. We do know that in that time, the theaters were closed. They would have been closed to Shakespeare because of this little thing called plague. Now, in this time, we know that he probably wrote his sonnet cycle. And a sonnet cycle is a selection of sonnets that move through different themes and usually have a patron. His patron was the Earl of Southampton. We know that there are allusions and records of performances in 1592 of his plays. So we do know that he comes back to London at that time, and that he essentially divided his life between London and Stratford-upon-Avon. So let's talk a little bit about his theater. The theater that we associate him the most with is the Globe. And this is one where he was part of the joint stock company that owned the theater. Now, in 1613, it did actually catch on fire during a performance of Henry VIII. Henry VIII was a play that required cannon fire, and apparently firing cannons, even with blanks, still, was enough of a spark to burn down a wooden structure. We do know that the Second Globe Theater was built on the same site and closed in 1642. Currently, there is a reconstruction of the Globe at the same spot, Shakespeare's Globe, 750 feet from the original. It's pretty close. So, we do know that they have rebuilt the theater, and you can actually go and see plays at Shakespeare's Globe. Here's a picture here are 3 pictures of what the Shakespeare's Globe would have looked like. They did try to make it as close to the original as possible. So if you notice at the very bottom, you can see the very bottom picture has what it would look like if it were filled to capacity, meaning that the galleries are filled in the section where you would stand, the groundlings, as they were called. That is essentially where the poor people could pay a halfpenny or some very small form of money to see the play. Let's talk a little bit about his company. So his company was first called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. It would then be switched to the Queen's Men and the King's Men. They would become the King's Men in 1603 when King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England. We know that they had exclusive rights to Shakespeare's plays and that Shakespeare wrote many of his male roles for Richard Burbage. Now, if you look at Shakespeare's tragedies, these are essentially the stories where somebody dies. That's pretty much how you know it's a tragedy. Or if you look at the title and it's someone's name, they're going to be dead. Every single one of these plays, the main character dies. So let's talk about the comedies. Now, we do notice that Troilus and Cressida is listed under the comedies, and that is a play with two names, and they don't necessarily die. Although in the Greek myth, they do die. So let's talk a little bit about what comedy means. Comedy is essentially, does a marriage happen? It doesn't have to be funny. That is where a lot of people get upset with, the Comedy of Errors or Love's Labour's Lost or The Merry Wives of Windsor because, they're not that funny. Comedy has very little to do with being humorous and a lot to do, does somebody get married? Now, Shakespeare was known for his history plays, and part of the history plays were pretty much to kiss up to the monarchy, particularly Henry V. He wrote Henry V in 1599, and this play was designed to help the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth I, actually raise money for the war effort in Ireland, to send Essex, one of her chief advisors, to Ireland. Let's talk a little bit about the sonnets. So a sonnet in Shakespeare's time would have been a 14-line poem written in iambic pentameter. Shakespeare's sonnet, or the Elizabethan sonnet, or the English sonnet, would have 3 quatrains, so 3 parts of 4 lines each, and 1 couplet. There's another sonnet style called the Petrarchan, or the Italian sonnet, which would be an octave, 8 lines, and a sestet, 6 lines. There's also the Spenserian sonnet, which is a little more convoluted, but still 14 lines. We do know that his patron for this collection was the Earl of Southampton. There's also a dedication to Mr. W.H., which could possibly be the Earl of Southampton himself. We know that he wrote several longer poems, and this is possible after 1592. These were essentially dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. So, what happened to Shakespeare? After 1610, we know that Shakespeare wrote fewer plays, and actually, he collaborated on many plays. We know that he collaborated on more plays than he wrote by himself. We know that he died April 23rd, 1616, and is buried at the Holy Trinity Church, and that he essentially said, "Don't move my bones or you will be cursed." He did this because there was one of the wives of Henry V, Catherine of France, was reported to have been exhumed and her body played with after her death. So let's talk a little bit about understanding his language. So baldrastry refers to the excessive